Today's topic is very much around the production and processing and sale of food, and we're particularly looking at how does big data participate in some of the issues around producing enough food for eventually 8 billion people and then getting that food to where it needs to be. I'm not going to say any more other than to invite Judith to come forward and tell us a bit about what's going on in Sainsbury's.
Well, hello everybody. First of all, I want to say thank you for inviting me. I always think it's a great pleasure to be able to talk about our business, but particularly perhaps the bits of our business that you may not be so familiar with. So in my role at Sainsbury's, I'm director of Sainsbury's brand, as Nilay's already said. I'm responsible for sourcing about 12,500 products. And you may think of us as a UK retailer, but actually we're a global business because we source from about 72 countries around the world. Those 12,500 products are about half of our turnover, and therefore they're material to the impact that we have as an organisation. In fact, the cost of the goods that we buy for resale to our customers is the single biggest cost to our company, and it's where we have the single biggest impact. The key for us in terms of the challenges around sustainable living, food security, feeding a growing population, requirement for more water, energy, and all of those things then under the undercurrent of climate change are no small feat. And we talk a lot in our business about driving sustainable intensification. But for us, the key point about sustainable intensification is really about knowledge intensification. So the more that we know, the more likely we are able to make the right decisions, and the right decisions not just for our business, but indirectly to the value chains that we source from. And it's interesting to think that the 12,500 products that we sell, we really have no direct control over. So our job is to influence those value chains whilst we don't absolutely control them, and that's why data is so important. I don't need to tell you all about big data, but the accuracy, the truthfulness of that data, the cleanliness of that data, the speed, the volume, and the variety of that data is all important. And one of the biggest challenges for us in a business is not so much the variety of data sources that we have, but the quality of those data sources and the ability of one data source to talk and be able to be mapped to another data source. But essentially what we would do as a business is we do two things. There is publicly available data that we will be pulling on, and then there is data that we pay to collect. And that data can be everything from the Nectar card data that we collect when you shop with us and you use your Nectar card, to the data that we pay the Met Office for to ensure that our supply chain and logistics teams work properly, or the data that we collect from all of our farmers on everything from herd health and things like mastitis and lameness in the dairy herd to their energy use and the way they might be managing the quality of water. And we use that data in two ways. First of all, to benchmark our performance, both as our business but also for our farmers. So if you're one of our dairy farmers, you get 14 different metrics around herd health and environmental impacts. Every year you get that data collected by an independent third party, so it's standardised and we know the methodology by which it's collected. And you get yourself benchmarked against your peer group of the other 309 farmers in the group. You get compared to the top 10%, the bottom 10%, and the average, and you get then red, amber, green rated and given some opportunities to improve those metrics. And for our dairy farmers, between 2008 and 2012, they saved 11.5 million between them just on productivity and yield gains by using that data to improve them. So benchmarking and improving performance. But the bit that we get really excited by is where we use this data to have fun and find new insights and new questions to answer, but also where we can actually use the data to answer questions that we've been struggling with. And that's almost a bottomless pit. The forecasting and the benchmarking of performance is very much based on historical performance data. The answering the questions and looking for those insights is a lot more about forecasting and modelling and future gazing. And I have to say, as a retailer, we're not very good. Most retailers aren't very good at foresight. We're great at hindsight, rubbish at foresight. So this is quite good for us. And why is all of this happening? Why would a supermarket be doing all of this? Well, first of all, it's a lot cheaper than it used to be. So the collection and the handling of data, and we can handle it a lot faster and quicker. So a lot of things that we're doing now aren't just looking at historical data, it's real-time data. And whether that's real-time data about what we're selling in our shops or real-time data about where some of our container ships coming from China to the UK are and what's on board, and all of those kind of things are faster, cheaper and better than ever. Also, existing data sources have become much more accurate and much more granular in the way that we can look at them and the detail in which we can look at them. So weather forecasting in particular, we work very closely with the Met Office on all sorts of things, from short term, is it going to be sunny this weekend? Because the difference for us between a sunny weekend where everyone barbecues, has burgers, sausages, chicken thighs and drumsticks and bags of salad, or whether they buy big lumps of meat and potatoes and root vegetables, can be the difference of £15 million over the course of a weekend. And if we get that wrong, that is potentially fresh food that goes to waste. So getting those short-term forecasts very accurate, but also thinking about where are our potato farmers going to grow potatoes in the future? So in 25 years' time, is being a potato farmer in Scotland a good thing or a bad thing? Fortunately, it's a good thing in 25 years' time, because we actually have got a lot of potato farmers in Scotland. But also, as well as existing data sources getting better, we've got new data sources. And one that you've probably all heard of before, but the one that is the most impressive is the data that comes from genome sequencing. So the fact that, in real terms, if you go back to 2001, the cost of mapping a genome versus the cost of mapping it today has fallen remarkably. And you can today look at a genome, and we're doing some work on a strawberry genome at the moment, which is not the easiest to map, for all sorts of traits around water usage, growth rates, flavour, all sorts of things. The cost of doing that is well within the cost of a supermarket to do. And I think somebody told me that when they first sequenced the first tree, all those years ago, it cost $30 million to sequence a poplar. Clearly it doesn't cost that now. So the cost of doing those things, and things becoming much more accessible. So that satellite there is called a cube satellite. It's 10 centimetres square. You can buy one for about £25,000 if you're that way inclined. And the cost of putting it into space is becoming cheaper. So 2000, it was £10,000 a pound. It's now down to £1,000. In 2025, it will be down to $100 a pound to put that satellite into space. And of course, those satellites can look at anything. So how are we using these things? Well, we're combining some of those data sources with things like remote sensing to think about creating what we call the farming Internet of Things. And again, you can use that for all sorts of things, whether that's the prediction of outbreaks of things like blue tongue virus, which was some work that the Pirbright Institute did, which meant that essentially when that outbreak came, some sophisticated modelling around weather outbreak meant that the vaccination that had to be done could be very specific, which is a good thing in itself. In the context of things like antimicrobial resistance. Also a good thing in terms of the cost of wholesale vaccination versus very targeted vaccination. And the economic estimate of that saving was £570 million that by controlling that blue tongue virus outbreak. So lots of examples about how that data can be used. How are we using it? We're using it in a number of ways. We're the biggest retailer of MSC fish in the world. But we also know that it's no good being the biggest retailer of MSC fish when 25% of the world's fish is illegally caught. So when we have our lovely certificate with our chain of custody, and you'll all know that anyone can write anything on a piece of paper, so whilst you might have that piece of paper that says this is where the fish has come from, you don't really know. That is an act of faith. that piece of paper is accurate. We can actually look at that piece of paper that might have said, this is line-caught cod from the North Atlantic fishery. It was caught on this date by this vessel. It was landed on this date at this port. I can now look at satellite imagery at the satellite catapult in Harwell. When we've done this, we're using it as part of our surveillance. I can see that vessel, I can see when it went out, I can see where it fished, I can see that if it was line caught, because it will be going up and down as opposed to round in circles. And I can see the data that it came back, and I know from what that data is clashed with at the port what was unloaded and what was sold on. And that means that not only can we protect our brand from disreputable and criminal behaviour, and you only have to look at what happened with horse meat to know that isn't great for a brand, and that didn't happen to us, by the way. But it also means you can turn what might be risk mitigation and management into competitive advantage. Another way we're doing this is with asparagus from Peru, and I'm very happy to answer lots of questions about asparagus from Peru, because there will be about water usage and everything else. But essentially, actually, it is very easy to grow lots of asparagus in Peru, so 14.8 tonnes per hectare yield on average, because it's like growing in an outdoor greenhouse, versus 2.8 tonnes per hectare average in the UK without the use of fertilisers. But there are all sorts of other downsides as well. However, if you can sea freight asparagus as opposed to air freight it, then all of those environmental impacts stack up, and it is better to sea freight asparagus from Peru than it is to try and grow it with lots of fertilisers in a climate like the UK that isn't really meant to grow it very well. So what we've done essentially is use remote sensing into those containers to manage the temperature, the humidity and the gas combinations in those containers, GPS satellite to track the container. That means that we know exactly when it left Lima, exactly when it's going to arrive in Felixstowe, and on the basis of those time and temperature records, we can predict the shelf life of that product, which means that we can sell customers a better quality product with the right shelf life. And if you then combine that with data-embedded barcodes, that means that when the barcode's scanned, that life can be automatically calculated, then you can flex the life of that asparagus depending on how long it took to get from Peru to the UK. All of that's been proved by funding from the Catapult, and that's just the beginning of some of the ways that we can use data. But I suppose the key for us in all of this is what do you do with all of this data? So I could get very carried away by the possibilities of what we could do with this data, but not necessarily things that are practical for our business or indeed commercial for our business. I can get carried away with how I combine customer data with health data, with what the nation is producing in terms of food and the nutrition quality of a chicken today versus a chicken 30 years ago. And there is a big difference in the nutritional quality of a chicken today versus 30 years ago. And I can plot all of those things. But what I can do is now moving ahead much faster than regulation and frameworks and guidance can keep up. So I think one of the big challenges for us as a business is how much of this data should we be using, particularly when it's customer data? What would customers be expecting us to do with that data, linking it to other things? And what does the future look like for that? So all I'd leave you with is the thought that change is inevitable, particularly in this whole area of big data, but that progress isn't necessarily the output of all of that. And the progress really is about driving the change that we want to see in the future. And that requires a lot more frameworks, regulation and structure around this whole area. With that, I will say thank you very much for listening and hand over. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me along. My name is Scuffell from Syngenta. I'm based at our Jellots Hill Research Centre, which is just over in Berkshire. We're just going to talk today about what I feel are a couple of really key important things about data, particularly in R&D. I'm in Syngenta R&D, so we are the part of the research pipeline that's supposed to bring new products for us to take to market. It's a role or a part of the business that has changed dramatically, I think, over the last 20 years, and a lot of that is driven by data. The main challenge that we focus on in Syngenta is this, that we have to feed a lot of people. In order to do that, we need to be more productive in a sustainable way. We're expecting an extra 2 billion people by 2050, and all these people have to be fed. And quite how we're going to do that is not solved by any means, and nobody really understands how we're going to do it. But part of the contribution here is understanding how we can improve the productivity of farming around the world. And Syngenta believes that part of that contribution is definitely going to come from the full range of farming that is available. So there are large farms in the world, large-scale farms, but there is a very significant long tail of smallholders who can also contribute to this global food security challenge. We have launched a good growth plan that is focusing very much on sustainability and allowing us to measure how successful we think we are, how successful we are actually going to be in meeting that challenge. So we've got 6 commitments in that good growth plan around food, growing more from less, biodiversity, and the workers that are actually on farms. So the first off, just making crops more efficient is really about how we can apply some integrated techniques, which I'll talk about in a second, to improve productivity on the farm. There's a significant amount of farmland that has gone out of production due to perhaps previous types of operation that it's been susceptible to, which we are bringing back into operation. So we want to look at how we can do that. There's also the opportunity on farms to encourage slightly more diverse, rich habitats to help biodiversity, and we're doing a lot of work in that area as well that we want to discuss. And then these final 3 here around smallholders, that long tail that really could make a potential benefit to the food security issues. So empowering smallholders by actually training with tools and techniques so that they can improve their productivity. Small changes in those areas could make a significant change for large parts of the world. Helping people stay safe through training, so that we're training them not just on our products and the safe way to use our products, but also on agricultural operations in general. And then the last part here about looking after every worker is recognizing that, as Judith was saying, the supply chain that we work in today, nobody owns a whole supply chain anymore. We actually work with partners all the way down supply chains. So we want to make sure that everyone who's working for us is working under safe labour standards. So those are our 6 commitments, and I'm going to come back to that right at the end, because the only way we can really judge whether or not we're working to these is through data. There's a couple of challenges that we actually have in R&D to feed that research pipeline for Syngenta. So first off, over the last few decades, there's been this decline in discovery rates. So this is data from USDA on registrations of pesticides. So crop protection products, new products are declining. You can see there was a kind of a peak around, ignore that spike around the 70s, which is where it was just a small change in the means and the way they registered products. But you can see there was a peak around about the 70s, and there's been that decline. And that same pattern occurs not just with new AI discovery, but things like trait discovery for crop breeding as well. It's a very familiar trend. And the other thing that's really important is that the cost of doing this discovery is increasing as well. So we pay money to do the science and research to discover new traits and new crop protection technologies, but we also have to spend money making sure they're safe to go into the environment and do all the development work on those as well. And there was an interesting point in 2005 where that tipped over, so you can see the cost in 2005 on the development phase, a bit in orange there, is greater than on the research phase. Again, this is USDA data here. So those are challenges. It's harder to find new things, it's more expensive to find new things. And the only way we're going to get out of this is really by effectively using more and more data to do this. We need to explore this scientific space more effectively. When we want to get to our new data, there's 2 things that are really important. First of all, there's a set of legacy data that are assets. Every company like ours has decades and decades of data which we don't use effectively. We need to be able to get to that, and we need to use new technologies to break into those silos and get that data. In addition to that, there's external data which exists as well. But then this really comes on to something that Judith was saying, is that what we can really expect is new types of data, new shapes of data from new environments and emerging technologies. So on the left there, I've got a picture of a controlled environment. So that's from the UK Plant Phenomics Network. So the idea of having controlled environments where you can really grow big plants and you can use things like imaging technology to look at the plant and assess its greenness or growth and its productivity. If you can do this on a kind of an industrial scale, then you can really start to pump out some very useful data. So you've standardized on the controlled environment, and then the difference you're seeing is in the phenotype of the plant. And then on the right-hand side there, the idea of things like adaptive sensor networks. So these are networks in the field of low-cost sensors that are monitoring the environment at high resolution. Networks that can adapt to the environment as well and change their behavior according to that. So this is some work that we're doing with Aberystwyth University at the moment. The idea that the network might say, actually, this is a really interesting thing that's happening right now. This is particularly hot. I'll just start laying down and taking data observations much faster than I normally do. And the network all the time worrying about how efficiently it can route data back as well. So adapting all the time to the environment. But it means that you are never going to consistently have the same shape or size of data coming back. There will be different rates and different types of data that come back. Lots and lots of old data to try and cash in on those assets. Lots and lots of new data coming along that we need to worry about. But then what of the future? So right now, I described our business as having mainly this kind of focus on crop protection and seeds and new traits, but the reality is what we should expect in the future is very much an integrated agricultural approach. So here's an example from HGCA on control of blackgrass, and you can see that the occurrence of blackgrass declines as they apply each of these different pieces of agronomic operation. But on the right-hand side there's applying herbicides. That's traditional crop protection techniques. Competitive varieties just before there on the right-hand side, that's choosing the right variety to actually plant of your crop so that it's competitive with the blackgrass. But there are all these other things that can be done. So this integrated approach to agronomy is the thing that's going to win out and give us this sustainability as we go forwards. But to do that, we have to understand what is the appropriate agronomic approach to apply to the environment that we're actually in. And HGCA make this point in that they actually say, well, that blueprint that you've just seen there isn't actually a blueprint for every single field. You have to adjust it according to every farm field that you go to. In some respects, you need to really understand the environment that you're operating in so that you can apply the right integrated agricultural approach. And if we take that to its logical conclusion, then really we need to think about every individual plant. Wouldn't it be great if we really understood the microenvironment around every single individual plant, and we could actually make some useful decisions for the farmer based on that? This is kind of like personalised healthcare, but for each individual plant. And that is our kind of panacea, really. That's our nirvana that we want to try and aim for, if we can get to that level of understanding. So the data that drives this is the important thing then. So first off, if we think about integrated agriculture, this is a rice product of ours, and we've described this as an integrated crop solution. So what happens here is the farmer wants to plant their paddy field out. They ring the distributor or their provider and they say, I want to be able to plant rice in 3 weeks' time. And in 3 weeks' time, people turn up and they plant the paddy field out for them. That sounds very simple, but actually to do that is quite complex, because if you want to plant all of these rice plants out in a paddy field on demand, you've got to first of all grow them so that they're ready to be planted. And the other thing about rice planting is that traditionally it's done by hand. It's not mechanically done normally because the plants are quite fragile. So if you want to build an integrated solution that can provide that kind of level of service to a grower, you have to understand, have data available that's so much more than just crop protection or genomic data. You need to understand about the agricultural engineering that goes into machinery. You need to understand about the tensile strengths of pieces of plant, the plant physiology. What's its life, what's likely to happen to it in the 48 hours in the supply chain prior to it arriving at the farm itself. So this sums up for me what I believe is one of our biggest challenges, and it's how do we integrate data so that we can deliver integrated solutions. We hear a lot about big data and some really cool tools, modelling and things that people do with big data. But this is one of the biggest data challenges that I think we have. And I don't think that any private organisation, any single company is going to be able to solve this. This is only going to be done through really quite a community-based approach. So what is it that we can actually usefully do to make that data integration work? For us in Syngenta, one of the biggest challenges with this is the cost. We have a group in North Carolina who work on core water optimization. Very frequently, they grab data sets from the public space internally in Syngenta, they bring them together, and then they prise open these data sets and they go through and they try and work out what is it that they've actually got here. They've got some really useful, really cool scientific questions they want to answer, and they think this data can do it, but they have to prise open the data sets, they have to go through and curate it, describe what it is, work out what's in there, do all the stuff that Judith was referring to with regards to data quality. All of that needs to be done. And then finally, they get to do the cool science on the right-hand side, the in silico science on it, and they answer. And we know that that does work. We know that bringing data together to answer questions does work. Very recently, we've got a high number of trait candidates going into our research pipeline because of that. So we know it's valuable. But the problem is that first bit is 80% of the cost. And we did a small survey, actually not just in Syngenta, with some partners as well. Big cost in just getting that data integrated. What we're really interested in is how can we reduce that cost? How can we integrate once so that it can be reused over and over again? And the approach that we're using is actually not ours. It's very much in the wild, and it's really based around the semantic web. But the big challenge that is ours is bringing about the cultural change that allows this to happen. Okay, so technically this works. This has been proven, and in fact we spent some time proving this within Syngenta, but the cultural change is the challenge. But the first one of people must describe their data. So we want people to think of their responsibilities, their corporate responsibilities as far as Syngenta goes, and public responsibilities, to ensure when they produce data, they actually describe what it is they're producing. And they describe that in a standard way. They use ontologies to do it. They use W3C web standards to do that, and they describe it in a standard way. This happens in the wild. I'll talk about that in a second, but this doesn't happen in Syngenta. This is a big change. Generally speaking, in a lot of organizations, when someone goes and builds some sort of application to manage or to help with some business process, they build an application, they build a database, they all get locked in a big silo, and they never gets exposed and reused. That data asset is locked up and broken away. So we want people to describe their data well, describe it in a standard way, use ontologies to do that. Then we want them to be able to share their data. We ensure there's a platform there for them to land that data so that somebody else can use it. And we do that through using linked data, a semantic web linked data approach. So the data is described well, and then the data is exposed in this very standard W3C way so that it can be reused anywhere within the company. And then thirdly, we introduce a culture of reuse. So people look to reuse existing data assets if we can. So that one on the end there actually is a really interesting one. This comes from our research site in Stanton. There's some geospatial data there, i.e. the position of each of the plants that are in these plots is recorded, but that's recorded so they can do nice straight plots. The planters that go out do nice straight plots, and that data gets thrown away afterwards. And somebody had been driving some drones over and doing this NDVI reflectance measurements, and they said, well, actually, if I just correlate that on top of your geolocation data, I've suddenly got all the reflectance for all the individual plants within the plot. So a really useful way of just combining data together that wouldn't normally be used. So if we do that, if data integration happens through this idea of describing data well, then we can build a data ecosystem within our business, certainly, that can be used. So ignoring the fluffy stuff at the bottom, the bit in the middle there is using this semantic web approach from the W3C, but what you end up with is an ecosystem or a marketplace where applications and useful services to growers and to people and scientists can just develop. It separates the application from the data itself. So first of all, I would say, I was very skeptical about this approach many years ago when we started, and I actually did some work. We did some work with Thomson Reuters to test this with our chemists, and it worked very, very well. It was just a POC that we did. But I came back to this point about this is not going to be solved by any single company or organization. It needs a community approach. And this is why, and this has worked in the wild for because of organisations like this existing. So first of all, the linked open data movement on the web actually shows this works. You know, this started in 2004, I think it was, or 2007. Just a few million facts put out there in this format, and now there are hundreds of billions of facts out there available. Data sets are exposed. If you go to the linked open data website, you'll see lots of things you're very familiar with, right from genomics data, which is the pink portion on the bottom right, through to things like Music Brains and BBC, and you can see how all these data are linked together. In the middle, AIMS, part of the Food and Agriculture Organisation, they very early on took a stance on this, started to describe reference terms, common terms for agriculture, but they did it in the semantic web way, which means it's really easy to pick it up. So now, in our business, we can just link to terms that the Food and Agriculture Organisation have already done. So it saves the job of this description. We can say, when I mean wheat here, I mean wheat as defined by the FAO over there, and I just have a URI in there to do it. It's a really amazing job. And then the new kid on the block, and really a sleeping giant right now, is GODAN. So GODAN was an initiative that started 2013 G8. DFID, UK DFID, picked up the lead, I think with the US, on that, to form this project. And this is the Global Open Data for Agriculture and Nutrition network. The idea is, well, it's still very formative at the moment, but the idea is that they will start to guide and set direction for open data standards within agriculture and nutrition. And I think it's going to be a real changer for us, because I think we're seeing initiatives starting, but no one's pulled all this together. And I think with that kind of backing, we're going to see that happen. And then this same approach used by the CSIRO for their smart farms. They did this a long time ago. This already exists. Prior to everybody talking about the Internet of Things, CSIRO were doing this with sensor systems on farms. Again, all described with ontologies. Our very first piece of public work in this space is on this Good Growth Plan. So we've been doing some of this integration work inside in Syngenta. It's very important to us, but we've now extended this to outside. So that all of that Good Growth Plan data we have made available as RDF and as open data. So we've had a lot of help from the Open Data Institute, and a couple of weeks ago we had the announcement that we were doing it. We're the first New York listed company to join the Open Data Institute and to open our data that way. But we're very pleased with the result. We're very thankful for the support we've had from the Open Data Institute to do that. But what it does do is it reinforces this rigor I was telling you about. Describe your data well, make sure it's publishable, because it naturally comes. To get that ODI certificate on your data, you have to kind of tick those tick boxes. Thank you.
My question is, I wonder if you have a working relationship.
Yeah, we do. If you think about the grand challenges that we have as a society to feed people healthy, safe, nutritious food that's accessible to everyone globally, which is clearly a sort of basic right, then we have to manage those value chains very differently going forward. And I think there are two things that are fundamental. One is the interdisciplinary approach of how you look at that. So from a scientific point of view, it isn't one science anymore that is going to answer the questions. It is all of the disciplines coming together and working in an integrated way, because we need the analysis that one discipline can give us with the foresight that another can and the data that goes with that. And the second thing is we have to think about value chains in an end-to-end way, right from the genetics all the way through to what happens when that product is at the end of its life cycle, or the way that waste is managed. And the reason you have to manage those value chains end-to-end is because some of the expense and the research and development and investment might have to go into one part of the value chain, which isn't a true investment, but the benefit is seen in another part of the value chain. And because those value chains are not integrated, well, there aren't actually very many integrated value chains, then that requires people working together in a way that they've never worked before. If we can't get over the interdisciplinary piece, and we can't get over managing our value chains end to end, then we're all pretty doomed, really. Which is why we now work directly with our dairy farmers. But we're not doing as much globally as we would like to, so perhaps we should compare notes on that.
It's about talking the same language, really, isn't it? That's the kind of integration challenge, really. So, you know, we talk about farm to fork, and actually there's possibly something before farm, isn't there, as well?
Yeah, definitely.
You know, so it's almost research to fork. And when you get to the consumer at the end, what you really want is that full set of provenance that's come with whatever it is that they're eating or consuming in some way. You know, to me, the challenge here is it's about how the language of the data, those ontologies, that data description, is not proprietary. It's in an open space, so everybody can use it. That's what needs to happen to really make this work. And while that's not happened, this can only ever move forwards with collaborations and partnerships, which I think probably turn out to be quite expensive because you're going through that integration cycle on every single one of them. The only way to really make this a super efficient way of cooperating is to do that integration piece where we start to really describe what it is in the value chain that we're working with. There was an initiative, I don't know if it's still going, called the registry, it was by the Open Data Registry, and it was called the Web of Goods. And it was a really smart idea, and it was started up by a guy called Dean Alleman, I think, in the US, who just said, well, can we not just describe what the needs are of consumers and the needs are of, and what producers produce, and start to build the metadata around that? And then we just start to hook up, I don't know, it might be cotton producers over here with somebody over here. And that's the kind of smart thinking we need and direction that needs to be in place for this to work for everybody, really.
This sort of concept of on-demand production, are either of your organisations doing anything to take that further back up the supply chain? So helping farmers to manage, you know, at what point they produce certain goods. Obviously, you know, as a grand trend, you want strawberries in the summer, etc. But I mean, from a week-by-week basis, are you going to that sort of granular level? And if so, can you tell us a little bit about that?
It's just an interesting one, actually, about chickens, because I'm always amazed at what the food industry has done, because I've worked in it for a very long time. And you know, the fact is we can manage to grow a chicken in 39 days now, start to finish. And it's the fastest growing protein that's being consumed in the world, and it's relatively good value for money. But the trade-offs in growing that chicken in 39 days in terms of the nutrition content of that chicken is quite different. So if you look at the fatty acid profile of a chicken 30 years ago and a chicken today, then the chicken 30 years ago, from a human nutrition point of view, was a better chicken to eat for us than chicken is today. Having said that, relatively, chicken is, depending on what aspect of the nutrition you're looking at, is better than eating other alternatives in, you know, red meat and all those kind of things. So we have a challenge to say it's fantastic that we can grow a chicken in 39 days because that is a really efficient way of doing it, but you have to think about what that means for the nutrition of the chicken, the nutrition of the human, what that means for Brazilian rainforest, if it's GM soya that's been feeding the chicken that's been grown in an area that was previously rainforest. If you look at all of the interdependencies, whilst on one hand we must congratulate ourselves that we've got a very efficient value chain in producing chicken meat, but on the other hand, at what other cost? Some of these things are very complicated and there are trade-offs and you can't optimise all of the elements. Our job is to try and get to the best truth that creates the best chicken for human health, the best chicken for animal health, the best chicken for the environment, etc., etc. You would think that we are very sophisticated in terms of managing the demand side of our business. We will look at algorithms, we'll look at when Christmas fell on a Thursday, how many years ago, and what was the weather like on that Thursday versus the Thursday previous, when the weather was snowing, and we'd be very sophisticated in creating that demand. What we're not so sophisticated is connecting that to the supply. If you look, and we're doing some work at the moment on lettuce to say, how can we forecast better the lettuce production to coincide with our demand? Because even when it's really hot, we don't have enough lettuce, and when it's cold, we've got too much lettuce. But what we produce is always a surprise to us. So the key thing for us is how do you match that supply and demand and And if you're clever, how do you mitigate the supply side to match the demand side so that you don't get food waste, basically? And we could be a lot better at that. But the data is there, and these are all machine learning projects. So they're basically just looking at loads and loads of data points and playing out those scenarios. But you would be surprised at how much crop, not because people don't want to buy it. There's this fallacy that it's not class A and people don't want ugly veg. I mean, in the food, if you can buy it and you can sell it, you buy it. But the bigger issue is not whether it's ugly fruit and veg. The bigger issue is, have you matched the supply and demand properly?
The more we get into this, the more complex we realise this can be. And it is so dependent on particular growth stages of the crop as well, or what happened at particular growth stages of the crop. It's an incredibly complex thing to confidently predict. And we did have an experiment a couple of years ago with corn in the US, where we used what we thought were quite sophisticated models and benchmarked actuals against that. And it was surprising how difficult it was to actually come out and make hand-on-heart predictions about this. I guess, you know, the trade-off here from a data perspective is one of what is what's the variety of factors that you need or you can measure versus the number that you need to measure to successfully make a prediction. And the more that we look at this, the more we see there's more and more kind of drains to pull up and things to get at. So, for example, again, it was one I took off of the slides, but we had a project 2 years ago where we were making predictions about Sclerotinia outbreak in oilseed rape. So it was a great piece of work, developing a new sensor for it, nodes for those go into fields. Now the thing is, if you want to make a prediction about Sclerotinia outbreak, the presence of a Sclerotinia spore is not enough. You need to know whether the spore is viable or not. And then you need to understand an awful lot about the environment, not just the current environment that would cause the spore to germinate, but also the history of the farm and the soil around it, because previous spores from previous years, up to 7 years ago, may contribute to that as well. So what is apparently very simple, or pathologists would say very simple disease to predict, actually turns out to be quite a complex thing to predict. And as you add these extra factors in, what you're doing is you're putting layers and layers of technology in, which you need to kind of fund and find a way of using so that you can make a prediction. So the answer is yes, we do some of that. I think there's a whole new world of it to come as we get more and more able to measure things and we work out what it is we need to measure.
And I just add on that last point, we did some work with the Syngenta Foundation in Africa on that exact piece, because smallholder farmers spend far too much on agrochemicals, because if they think that a little bit of something is good, then a lot of it will be even better. So the overusage of fertilizers, pesticides, etc. And so one of the things that we tried to do through a phone app was, because they all use their mobile phones, was to try and predict some of those outbreaks, to advise them when to spray and when not to spray. But the whole thing fell down, not because they weren't pretty able in terms of using their mobile phones, but it was the quality of the modelling that we could do, which just wasn't good enough. And I mean, that was probably about 5 or 6 years ago now, and perhaps it's time to go back and relook at it. But these things are, as you say, you spend a lot of time finding the right bit of data and the right combinations of data that will be useful in those situations.
And the least bad model to use.
Least bad model.
I think, you know, potentially there's also some interesting sources of data for those as well. And I was just thinking back to CABI, who are a not-for-profit who operate in 33 countries around the world, running plant surgeries. So smallholders can come in with their kind of bent bit of crop or whatever, or half-dead bit of crop, and have it diagnosed for what it is. But those are the kind of, you know, what you're getting then is an observation in the field that happens now, and that's going to be more useful than something that's 3 months old or 4 months old. So there's probably something there I would have thought about again, communities working together to try and make this effective.
So in a total risk assessment, we will be looking at all of those geopolitical issues, food security issues, those predictions alongside the sort of hard, tangible data around climate change, weather patterns. When you do that, about 90% of the world goes red. So I say in our business, when you look at our global risk map that's very red, our job is then to find the data that enables us to get shades of red. Because if you looked at that, particularly now, you'd look at the whole of North Africa and say, I'm never going there, which clearly is not helpful to us, but it's not helpful to them. And I suspect that all of those things are around creating equitable value chains where everyone sees the value of them, because that's what brings overall stability. And I think that's why when you see things that have happened in East Africa, particularly Kenya, for example, that had a pretty well-established agriculture system and was doing some really good work. And in fact, you look at some of the things that they were doing, and very advanced. So you just kind of think of them as not being as advanced as we are in certain aspects, and in certain aspects they are far more advanced. Similarly, you go to Peru, and the technology that they're using to manage water and to grow is state of the art, and the government investing lots of money in it. But we're also very conscious that it doesn't take much to destabilise that, and I think the more you can create those significant value chains, they bring perhaps some of the stability that you'd be looking for.
From our point of view, it's slightly different. Obviously, shades of red are shades of red, but if you're, in our case, productivity of seed, for example, is actually done the year before, maybe 2 years before. These things tend to go into a supply chain, and we know when they come out the other end. And actually, if you think about things like crop protection chemicals, for example, or producing those, actually, the planning for that would have gone into building a plant that actually does that. It might be up in Grangemouth or somewhere that does that. So it's a lot more committed. There's very little opportunity to respond to quick changes.
I was very intrigued by your remark about, or your reference actually to genome sequencing. And obviously that's not the core of the work that Sainsbury would be doing. But I was intrigued looking at just different perspectives, looking at plants, the animal, but also the human. Are you planning to use this kind of genetic knowledge as well in your data modeling?
Well, not in humans at the moment, but definitely from an animal and plant perspective. And as I say, we're not experts in that, but one of the things that we do is end-to-end value chain research. So our partners will be right back to primary science, all the way through applied science, through our growers, packers, processors, and then finally to us. And I think it's only when you have got all of those partners in the value chain working together on a research project that you can create the market pull for the science, and you understand the potential of some of the primary science to be pulled through to market. And if there's one thing that's changed over the last 5 to 10 years, it's that aspect of research. So without wanting to offend anyone, what used to happen was people used to ring me up and say, I'm applying for a fund for this, can you write me a letter of support? And I'd say, that's something we're really interested in. Yeah, great, I'm really keen to be involved. No, don't want you involved, just want you to write a letter of support because I want to get my funding. And we'll let you know what the outcome is. And I think the number of calls and letters I get of that type have almost disappeared. Now, whether that's because they've just worked out that Sainsbury's aren't in that space, or actually the understanding of how you join all of that together is much more powerful. I don't know, but I do know that there are some really exciting things happening that I don't even think I could have imagined, let alone dreamt of, even 10 years ago. The fact that we'd be doing that, so the work we're doing on strawberries, for example.
The human genome was an absolute battering ram to getting to the state where that genome cost is coming down now, isn't it? I mean, I don't know what it was, 10 billion or something, wasn't it? And it's a lot lower now. But, you know, the work that went into that is fundamental. There's so much in terms of highly conserved genes that also occur in plants. So, and that piece of annotation and genome assembly around that has catapulted all the work that's been done on plant genomes. And, you know, plants are tricky because there's high levels of polyploidy and there's all sorts of complexities around that. So it's that work in the human genome is, you know, absolutely fundamental to pushing forward this and enabling it in our space. The thing it's also worth saying is that in agriculture and agritech, you know, it's tougher than in pharmaceutical world, I'll say that, because there's a big focus on the human genome, yeah, but actually we've got N plant species to worry about, and then there's all the pest species we need to worry about as well, and all those. So it's a bigger game to play with. We're waiting for a lot more genomes to be sequenced.
The question is about how does what you find in the data help you drive policy? When you would either recommend or simply put your foot down and say we will not continue to raise a chicken within 39 days, or make recommendations to the NHS or some other health organizations, WHO and things like that.
Yeah, it's a good one, because as an organisation, we choice edit to a certain extent, but we would always say that we offer customers choice. So clearly we wouldn't do anything that was illegal, we wouldn't do anything that was damaging, or knowingly do anything that was damaging to people or the environment or to plants or animals. But at the other end of the scale, we are a commercial business, so we want to be here tomorrow and in 10 years' time and in 20 years' time. And therefore, sometimes you realise things have to be a journey. And if you look at an example of where I think the industry has done that quite well, is the journey on removing salt from foods, removing sugar from foods. And whilst sugar is a fairly new thing, I mean, I can go back to 2004 when we were starting to remove sugar from soft drinks and things like that. So you have to go on a journey on some of those things and know that you could probably get to a solution quicker, but you wouldn't have a business. And making sure that you are one step ahead of everyone else on whatever it might be, but close enough to where customers are to take them with you, is the key in all of those things. But I would like to think that we say that we would be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. So if you took at something like agriculture in Peru, growing asparagus, which is a very emotive topic, and we get lots of letters on it, and people will show you sort of areas of desert, you know, where asparagus is being grown and the water that should be used isn't. You know, that land has been like that for years and years. That isn't because of asparagus growing, that's because, you know, when the Spanish came hundreds of years ago, they chopped all the trees down for various things, and those trees never regrew, and all of that has just been perpetuated. And actually, part of the solution is working with Kew Gardens to, through the Millennium Seed Bank, is to replant indigenous species that, you know, can cope with flood waters from the Andes once a year because their roots go down 80 metres, and funding those kind of projects, because actually there's something in it for us, and that's creating biodiversity corridors that are the pollinators for the asparagus, so I suppose we try and think whole systems thinking, and only walk away from problems when they are so awful that you don't think you can be part of the solution. So I think we can be part of the solution on chicken, actually.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, just to build on that, I think it's the whole systems thinking thing is really important. I think there's some real opportunities for data to drive policy around biodiversity on farms. So I think today we have an environmental land stewardship scheme where growers can get points for doing certain environmental land stewardship options, and that becomes part of their single farm payment. But wouldn't it be good if we were finding ways of measuring the success of those options, and actually you got rewarded on the outcome of those options? Yeah. Because what that would do is then make sure you chose the right options for your farm, for the area that you're in. It might be based on the existing biodiversity to increase that. There are all sorts of possibilities. But that would only be possible if there were ways we could measure that. for example. So I think I think there are great opportunities. I mean, I think one of the points about open data is it is available for use, even for commercial use. It's for anybody to use for anything. So I think there are a lot of perceived dangers in businesses, and there are definitely, you know, I'm sure, well, in fact I know, within our business there are certainly things that we wouldn't open because those are key to our future and their intellectual property and bits and pieces. But there are huge opportunities through communities of organisations sharing data in an open way to, I think, make life better for people, but also open up markets. So, you know, I think there are some great services. To get here today, I used Citymapper, you know, and Citymapper is what get you home when you're drunk from the pub, isn't it? How do I get home? You know, but actually, that's based on bags and bags of open data. If that data wasn't open, that wouldn't be possible. It's a great service, a very, very useful service. There are commercial services based on open data, and the more that is open, I think the more possibilities there are to make better services for people and make life better. And the tricky thing within organisations is just getting to the nub of, well, what is it you're going to allow to be open and what isn't, and what are the benefits? So, for example, wouldn't it be good if data on things like pesticide resistance was opened up and shared in a standard way, so that groups of companies could get together and sort out how they're going to respond to those kind of things around the world, for example. Now, at the moment, to do something like that, you've got to form quite strong collaborations and partnerships in industry to do that. And that means you're not going to be agile necessarily. You know, it means you're not going to be able to respond quickly. And there probably are lots and lots of opportunities.
The danger is that you end up with the haves and have-nots of data, and therefore the rest becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, which I think is very dangerous. And I think you would look at this in the way that we approach research, actually. You'd have the pre-competitive space and defining the data that sits in there, the publicly available data, the data that everyone should have access to in an equal situation. And then there's the data that you may have invested in that is part of your competitive context. And I think trying to define which data sits in which one of those pots is quite key. There's then a third pot, which is the data that has a value and that could be used for the common good. And I would say our shoppers' data. I mean, the Department of Health would love to know what people are really eating, because they spend a lot of money on the National Diet and Nutrition Survey, but actually we know what they're buying every week in their trolley. That would be a disaster for us to share our customers' data in that way. I think in the current climate, unless there was some way of framing and controlling that, and you've only got to look at customer, brands that have lost customer data like Sony, and banks that have lost customer data, that it just is a disaster from a brand reputational risk point of view. So I think it is complicated. But I do think there is another danger is the quality of that data to start with, and therefore the false assumptions that might be made by people having access to data that are not quite clear how they should be using it, if that makes sense. So I think the whole area needs some serious, not regulation in the truest sense, but some real framework put around it, because I think technology is moving faster than the governance procedures can keep up with it.
I think that was probably one of the success stories from the ODI, actually, from the Open Data Institute, is bringing that bit of rigour to it. And there's another organisation in the US which is a private organisation which has decided to define some data standards, and they use the term open in their title, but really it's an abuse of the term open, really, in that respect. But what the Open Data Institute are talking about is, well, in order for you to be able to get that certificate, you have to have applied the rigour, which means you're describing your data well, you're describing the data quality and content and those kind of things. So it's a good point, and that's a triumph for the ODI, really, to have achieved that.
Criminals look for the softest target in a value chain, and I mean, you wouldn't believe what we spend on testing products, but I can tell you whether an egg is a Scottish egg or it's a Welsh egg or it's through isotope testing, and we would do that because provenance is really important to customers, because if you were selling something that was meant to be British beef and it wasn't British beef, it was Argentinian beef, that would be a bad thing. It would be even worse if it was Argentinian horse meat. So we DNA test for speciation, as well as doing all sorts of things around heavy metals, dioxins and PCBs and all the things that, if you look at all the food scares over the last 20 years, they're all things that would be on our big testing list. And our suppliers know that, and our suppliers know that we do that level of testing. So if you were a criminal, you'd go somewhere where you know they don't do that. And everybody knows who they are. So, and the other point I would add is it was interesting how in that particular food scare that it all stopped at the retailers. So no one remembers that actually there were more instances of horse meat in institutionalised catering and the food service sector than there were in retail pack. And I think the fact that we are forced legally to label so many things when you're looking at retail pack food versus food service food, because you have to prove the due diligence about what you put on the label, you have to show that you have done all of that due diligence to say, if I'm calling this British beef, and if I'm calling this Welsh milk or Scottish eggs, then what have I done as a business to ensure that I've done as much as I can to prove that they are Scottish eggs? Whereas if you're selling a sandwich in a fast food outlet, you don't have to label anything. And therefore you don't necessarily have to put the due diligence systems in place to verify what you're putting on the label. And it sounds like it's a small point, but it's a huge point. Not that I'm bitter or twisted or anything.
Excellent. Well, can I ask you to thank our speakers once again?
Thank you.